Yes, go ahead.
Okay, so before we get started, I would like to go over some housekeeping items. Could you please make sure that you mute your mic? Can you please utilize the hand feature and/or chat? Corey and myself will be monitoring the presentation for hands and the questions. So throughout, if you have a question, please use both of those features and we'll make sure that your question gets asked. And we also have the opportunity to ask questions at the end. And we're here from 10 to 12 today. So we've left lots of time for questions. I wanted to let you know that this session is being recorded for future education and training. The link will be made available to you. If you would like a copy, can you just please let me know and I can send that link to you. Session 1, Addressing Social Isolation and Loneliness, is now available to everyone on YouTube. If you'd like me to send you the link, just let me know and I'll email that out. Okay, so good morning. I'm Tanya Gagno on behalf of Community Living Algoma. I would like to welcome CLA employees, our board members, family members, and guests from Community Living St. Mary's, Kenora Association for Community Living, Community Living Guelph Wellington, Community Living Upper Ottawa Valley, Community Living Brant, members of the Town Council of Horn-Payne, Social Services Sault Ste. Marie, Community Living Greater Sudbury. So welcome, and right now we have about 94 people on the call, so that's great. This morning I have the great pleasure in introducing Al Condeluci. So for those who aren't aware, I just wanted to share an introduction of him. So Dr. Al Condeluci has been a leader in community building, human services, and inclusive advocacy work for the past 50 years. Holding a PhD and MSW from the University of Pittsburgh, Dr. Condeluci has been the CEO of CLAS Community Living and Support Services, a major nonprofit community building organization in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, from 1973 to 2019. He holds faculty status at the University of Pittsburgh in the Schools of Social Work and Health Rehab Sciences, and is author of 7 books, including the acclaimed Interdependence, The Route to Community, 1995, and more recently, Social Capital, The Key to Macro Change, 2014. In 2018, he received the Key to the City of Pittsburgh, the highest civilian honor that can be given to a community member. He serves as a consultant, advisor, and human service coach, and is on a number of nonprofit boards and government commissions on state, local, and national levels. He helped found and convenes the Interdependence Network, an international coalition of professionals, family members, and consumers interested in community engagement and macro change. So today, he's here to talk to us about building community through social capital. Please welcome Al.
Thank you, Tanya. Thanks so much. And ladies and gentlemen, welcome. Let me add my welcome to you. We have 96 folks plugged in, so this is a great turnout, and it really shows the interest and the importance of capacity building and thinking about a community and community engagement. This webinar series that we're doing is a part of our community engagement project that was launched by Community Living Algoma back in the fall. And this community engagement project is essentially an effort to really change up some of the intervening ways that we support men, women, and children who are experiencing disabilities to have more meaningful community engagement opportunities and experiences. I think most everyone on the call, regardless of where you hail from or what level of stakeholder input you represent, know that individuals who experience disabilities have really been offset from the greater community and not fully included. And in fact, the entire agenda of organizations like Community Living Algoma and some of our brother and sister organizations that are also on our call today has been to see the and to facilitate the opportunity for meaningful engagement. And yet we know that individuals that are supported and individuals with other types of disabilities just languish in terms of wanting to and having the opportunity to be a part of the greater community. We have 5 workshops that we're going to be doing that are going to focus on this, and they're moving from the micro to the macro. The session that we did, the first session of the webinar that Tanya indicated is now available on our YouTube channel, focused on social isolation and loneliness, right? And that was our kickoff part of the webinar series, because what we know is that isolation and loneliness are on the rise around the world. That even pre-pandemic, we were seeing increased situations where folks were in either isolated or situations that rendered them more lonely. We examined loneliness and isolation the last time around in the session, and if you want a refresher, you could take a look at the YouTube link that Tanya indicated in her introduction. The antidote to social isolation and loneliness, even for anyone, is greater opportunity for community connection, and more importantly, the development of relationships in those community connections. This webinar that we're doing today is really going to focus in on relationships, on what sociologists call social capital, which is essentially the construct of relationships and friendships. So we'll have a chance to examine that a little bit more in this session, and really the takeaway that we're looking at in this session will really be in how do we support people who are vulnerable in developing meaningful relationships in the greater community, right? And so we'll sort of track that. We'll take a look at it. Again, this is also sort of micro-oriented in that we're thinking about individuals who are at risk and what we can do in supporting them, whether you're a family member, whether you happen to work for an agency, whether you're a board member for a human service agency, what we could do to really promote the development of relationships. As we move further in our series, we're going to really begin to look at macro issues. Our next session is going to focus in on mapping the community, identifying the resources, the places and the spaces where people gather, how we can come to sort of not just map the community, but really look at those resources as targets for connection. So that session will have some tools and strategies related to analyzing and examining our communities. But I don't want to get ahead of ourselves. Let's dig right in to our content for today. And as Tanya indicated in her introduction, I'm going to go through some concepts with you. We have this PowerPoint available. If you haven't gotten it, Tanya can make sure you do get it. And we also have some handouts that I'll refer to as we're going through this material. This is also being recorded, and it will be available in our webinar series on our YouTube channel. So let's jump right into this concept and this topic. And on the screen now, you see a wonderful quote that I really love. It's discovery consists of looking at the same thing as everyone else, but thinking something different, right? And so our topic is really focusing in on how do we lessen isolation and loneliness by helping people build relationships, right? Now, this goal of helping people build relationships, that's been a goal of rehabilitation from the very beginning, the initiation of formal rehabilitation efforts really all around the world. rehabilitation was basically founded in terms of supporting soldiers returning back from war and helping those folks reconnect to community, right? And so the goal, the very beginning goal of rehabilitation, and certainly the goal that I think all the agencies that are on our call today, and all the staff that are a part of our conversation today, know has been to get people included in community, get them involved in jobs and houses and being able to get around the community and building relationships. That's always been our goal. But we've struggled and we still struggle to achieve that, right? I want to examine that in our session today. And this idea of this, looking at the same thing as everyone else, that is getting people included and building relationships, but thinking something different, really frames this webinar today in a shift from micro perceptions to macro perceptions, right? Now, last webinar series, we introduced this idea, this juxtaposition of micro, which is focusing on the individual, macro, which is focusing on the community, right? And I want to dig into that a little bit more deeply today. But if you, just to get us started, I want to pose a rhetorical question to you. I'd like you to sort of just think about this. Again, whether you're a family member, whether you happen to be a person experiencing disability, whether you're a staff member, at whatever level, I want you to think about what are the top 3 goals, outcomes that you think or feel that the people your organization supports want in their lives, or what do the families want in for their sons and daughters who are experiencing disabilities? What do people want, right? Now, these 10 items that you see on this PowerPoint are all important ones, right? They are really all important outcomes in terms of what people might want in life. But I want you to focus in just a little bit more about what rises to the top in terms of, now this may vary or change based on who you're supporting, but if you had to choose 3 things, what would they be? Right? What would they be? What would be the top 3 wishes or goals that you would have? And obviously there one might be able to argue for any of these 10 as being, important, or maybe the most important. But as a rhetorical question, and we'll revisit this a little bit further into the program today. But really, to me, in my 50-year plus work in the field as a an advocate, and as a family member of folks with disabilities in my own family, the notion of friendships really rises to the top for me, because I really believe that friendships almost become antecedent to all these other issues, right? Or they're embedded in some way with these other issues. Now, when you think about what people want, when you think about folks that you're serving, or your agency is serving, or your community is supporting, and you begin to tangibilize this a bit more, what I've assembled here are reflections from really thousands of conversations that I've had with family members or with individuals experiencing disabilities, including my own family, right? Because in a way, when you think about what's most important, this gold bullet, right? Healthfulness, happiness, being safe, those are overarching kind of goals that we have for anyone in community, and not just people with disabilities, but any of us being healthy, happy, and safe are really fundamentally, overarching. And then the 4 bullets that are in purple, right? meaningful day activities, that is something to do, work, or participation in a way where your participation actually matters. Living where you choose to live, being able to get around your community, and then building relationships, right? These are the things that I've heard really from thousands of families, and there's certainly things that my own family wanted for my cousin Carrie, who had Down syndrome, for my dad with his Parkinson's, um, and actually, whether you have a disability or not is irrelevant. These things are fundamentally important to human beings, period, across the board, right? Now, again, if you focus in on this list and you look at that last bullet, right, friends and relationships, I really believe that that is antecedent to all the others. That is, we're gonna discover as we look at social capital a little bit more strategically, that social capital is really at the core of a healthier life. And social capital is at the core of a happier life. Actually, social capital promotes longevity. Um, Social capital becomes significantly important in getting jobs and being, making decisions of who you want to live with, and in being able to get around our community. So it really is a fundamental topic that I think is absolutely critical and key in reducing isolation and loneliness. Now, how have we done as a, toward these goals, right? This is what people want. They want to be healthy, happy, and safe. They want meaningful things to do. This is what people come to an agency like Community Living Algoma asking for. And so how have we done, right? How has organizations with supporting people with disabilities in Canada, in the United States, in Australia, UK, it doesn't really matter where, because we know the outcomes have not been very good. I'm going to just show you some of the data that I've culled through research, looking at clearinghouse data on some of these key variables. Number one, meaningful things to do, which essentially for many people is work, that literally, having a job, getting a job. And that we know that for people with disabilities, 76% of folks with disabilities, adults over the age of 18, are unemployed or underemployed. Housing, right? Only 6% of people with disabilities own their own home, as compared to 69% of folks without disabilities who own their own homes. Public transportation being limited, friendship voids, and social isolation. We covered that in the last webinar. The limitations in civic engagement and meaningful participation, and even that very last bullet, where we see in life expectancy data that people who experience disabilities die sooner than folks without disabilities. Right now, these data are woeful. Right, any society, any community should not be satisfied with this kind of data, right? And and so as we move forward in this particular webinar, we're going to want to answer this question: why haven't we done better, and how can we do better in getting people engaged, in getting people connected, right? Now, when I pose that question to myself, this little cartoon always pops up in my head, and I want to share it with you. It's a cartoon from the artist Gary Larson, from his Far Side cartoon series, and for some of you folks who might be aficionados of Gary Larson, you need to know that he has reemerged. He retired in the early '90s, and he has reemerged online, and you can you can track back to some of Larson's more recent cartoons on Facebook, actually. But anyway, look at this cartoon. It's two bees and they're on a beehive, right? And the one bee, his name is Fred. He has a map, right, of the honeycomb, and he's lost. And that's his female companion next to him, and she's saying, "Face it, Fred, you're lost." Right now, the cartoon is silly for a variety of reasons, actually. But one of the reasons it's silly is how could you be lost if you have a map, right? Because maps create, a algorithm, if you will, toward a a destination, right? So if I wanted to come to Sault Ste. Marie, and I would need a map for me to get there. I would have to have some kind of a sense of how do I get to this destination. Um, and and so having a map becomes important, but more important is you got to have the right map for the destination, right? So if I have a map of I don't know, I have a map of Ottawa, that doesn't help me get to Sault Ste. Marie. It's a nice map. It's colorful and it shows various roads and approaches. But you got to have the right map to get to the right destination, right? So we have a destination. What people want from us is they want to do meaningful things in the community. They want to be able to live where they choose to live. They want to be able to get around their community and they want to build friendships. That's what people want, right? So we have to have a map to get there. Now, the sad thing is that we do have a map in human services, but that map is the wrong map. It's a flawed map. And this idea of paradigms becomes an important element to understanding getting to a destination, because a paradigm is nothing more than a set of rules and regulations that really help people become successful toward what they want to do, right? So you have to have the right paradigm to get where you're at. Now, we do have a map in human services that we're using and that really dominates. It dominates, in terms of Parliament. It dominates in terms of the national agenda. It dominates in terms of agencies, private as well as governmental. And that paradigm is what's referred to as a micro paradigm, right? Now, the micro paradigm focuses on the individual, right? It looks at the individual, but more than looking at the individual, it looks at what's wrong with the individual, right? The micro paradigm will separate and congregate people. For example, the creation of our agencies has been in some ways a manifestation of the micro paradigm, right? So we get people out of institutions or long-term care experiences, and we move them into, I don't know, group homes, and we get them into day programs, and those things are still separate and congregative. They're not community. They're human service programs attached to the community, right? Our micro paradigm relies on experts. The focus of the micro paradigm is to say we go to experts who will help us solve our problems. And so if a family has a son or a daughter with a disability and they want their son or daughter to get a job, a house, a ride, and lots of friends, they come to an agency like Community Living Algoma, and they say, "Can you help me do this?" And we say, "Yeah, we're experts in that. We studied that in college, and we know what to do. We've read some books." So experts are really important in a micro paradigm. And then the goal is to fix the problem. Look at this little cartoon that's juxtaposed on this slide, right? It's another Gary Larson cartoon, and it shows a guy who has a pain in his back. His back is really causing him problems. And he as he thinks about his back really causing him problems, what do? If you have a pain in your back, you call your doctor, right? And so the doctor has him come into the office, and the doctor initially, when he hears the person's complaint, he thinks, well, maybe it's kidney stones or obviously something like that inside him. And so the doctor brings him in, and in the course of the examination, the doctor goes behind the guy, and he sees a rhinoceros horn stuck up his back, right? And he says, "Wait a minute here, Mr. Crumley. Maybe it isn't kidney stones after all." Right? Uh, in this silly cartoon, the problem is not micro, although that's where it manifests, but it's macro in that that's around the person that is in the way of achieving, the goal, right? So we have this notion of we want people to get jobs, houses, rides, and friends, right? That's what they ask us for. That's what they tell us they want. Um, and and so we think that this micro model will do that. I'm going to show it to you in a little more detail, right? Um, in a micro paradigm, the person is the problem, and they have a problem, and that problem rests in that person. This is a very classic medical model, right? So if you have, I don't know, if you have a stomach ache, and you call your doctor's immediate reflection is, well, there's something wrong with your stomach. Maybe you have an ulcer, or maybe you have acid reflux, or he thinks that you're the problem and the problem is inside you, right? And in the course of the effort, you label the person gets an identity based on their problem. They get a name for their problem. It separates, the person who has the problem. He begins to get separated. Um, an assessment is really done to further focus in on the problem, to create a treatment plan. And again, the treatment plan is really designed to eradicate or to ameliorate the problem and to fix the person, right? So this is a very classic paradigm, and it's one that still dominates in our field. Um, and I think about this in relationship to my cousin Carrie, for example. And you've heard me say in the previous webinar that Carrie had Down syndrome, right? And one of Carrie's challenges was she was born with a cleft palate that affected her speech. She couldn't articulate clearly because of the cleft palate. It was surgically repaired, but it still had this effect. So, what's the problem? Carrie has difficulty speaking. Where does the problem rest? Well, it's inside Carrie, and from this cleft palate situation. So let's give it a name, right? And so Carrie gets labeled, and then the label leads to separating Carrie, maybe sending her to speech therapy. Um, the speech therapist has a goal plan to try to help Carrie enunciate words more clearly, right? And the whole goal is to fix Carrie's problem so she can get a job, a house, a ride, and friends, right? Now, this is very classic, and it's so ingrained in our culture that we don't even question it, that it just is the way it is. It's just the way things go, right? Now, I want to just share with you that there are some really residual issues related to this micro paradigm, right? And here are four, I think, really problematic elements to the micro paradigm, right? Number one is it highlights what's different about the person. Now, you never start a relationship based on difference. You always start a relationship based on similarity, right? So from the very beginning, this micro model separates, segregates, stereotypes, and then creates a stigma about the person and their difference. So this is very, very powerful stuff, and it has a really a net effect that is really troubling. Let me just show you this slide. Um, this is the effects that when you start with difference, what ultimately happens. Now I got to tell you this. I first wrote about this in a book called Beyond Difference, and the book was published in 1996, 97, and as I was thinking about using this micro approach and really identifying people's problems all the time, that's sort of what we do in our field. I I wanted to understand it a little bit more, and what actually for me was really instructive was some research that I did at the Holocaust Museum in looking at how the Holocaust unfolded. How did that maniacal, travesty, just a horrific era? How did that actually happen, right? And actually, these things were things I learned in my research at the Holocaust, which affected how a culture, treated a group of people who were perceived as different, right? Now, that's a very, very sordid and detailed issue, but it's really important to understand that in services to people with disabilities, um, that micro approach ends up doing these kinds of things, right? This notion of separating people out and having separate programs for them, segregated residential settings, even where identities get blurred. I I know in the work that we're doing in Algoma, um, one of the things we want to do is gauge what does the community think about community living Algoma, because what we've heard is that we would be out supporting people, and members of the community would say, "Oh, those are Algoma's people, community living Algoma's people, they're CLA's people," and that literally the identity of disability gets wrapped up into somebody being seen as different, as separate, right? So these kinds of programs are the net result of all the efforts that we've done, and certainly, not just in Canada and the United States and Australia, New Zealand, Sweden, UK, Ireland. It doesn't really matter that we've used this micro model, and it's literally created this separation. So those outcomes I showed you, it's no wonder that we have these poor outcomes, right? Because I think we use the wrong map. And so in a segue of this, in really thinking about how we're trying to help people get meaningful engagement opportunities in community, here's the question we have to ask: is what we're doing right now, is this as good as it gets, right? Are these things as good as it gets? A separate program, sheltered workshop, separate recreation program, Special Olympics. I mean, are these as good as it can be? And I think the answer to this is not just no. This is not as good as it gets. I think it's hell no. It's not as good as it gets. That we could do better. And I think part of the struggle has been the handcuffs that we've had put on ourselves based on the paradigm or the map or the approach that we're using to help people have meaningful experiences in community. And so here's the segue. It's a sheep in a midst of a herd of sheep, and the sheep is reared up on his hind hoofs, and he's got his paws up in the air, and he says, "Wait, listen to me. We don't have to be just sheep." So it's again, a silly cartoon, but there's a metaphorical segue here. And that is, we have 95, 96 folks interested in a more inclusive community on this call today, right? And so here I am saying to you, amidst, it's an advocate in the midst of 96 other advocates saying, wait, listen to me. We don't have to use the micro approach. There are other things we can do, other ways that we can support people, intervene in creating more meaningful outcomes. Because destiny is not a matter of chance, ladies and gentlemen. It's really a matter of the choices that we make, the decisions that we put together in terms of here's how we're going to intervene, here's how we're going to help, here's how we're going to support this individual. And so, as we think about this, what I want to do is I want to shift gears and again go back to that quote that started: discovery consists of of looking at the same thing as everyone else but thinking something differently. Okay, and and with that quote in mind, this I want us to shift from a micro perspective of how we could get people engaged to a macro perspective of how we can get people engaged, right? It's almost like a hologram. If there's a hologram and you have that in a an art gallery, and you're standing looking at the hologram, and you're standing in the same spot, you see certain colors and certain shapes. Um, but if you move to the other side of the room in the art gallery, and now you're looking at the hologram from another angle, you see a whole different picture, right? So the shift is not what happens to the hologram. The shift is what happens to us as we look at the hologram, right? So this shift from micro to macro, I want to just focus in on this macro approach, because this is the lens in which I think we see differently in terms of possibility, in terms of impact, right? Because in a macro paradigm, the problem isn't the person, right? The problem is the attitudes and perspectives around the person, right? It's not the individual, it's the interpretation of the individual. Um, and so if that makes sense to you, then clearly everything else changes, right? Because in order to address the problem, you've got to understand culture and community rather than disability, um, Down syndrome, whatever, Parkinson's. You got to understand the culture and the community, right? And actions, macro actions, really need to be understood, right? So a macro action can be formal or it can be informal, but a formal macro action is the passage of a law or or a a some kind of an edict that formally messages to the rest of the culture, this is what we're going to do. This is how we're going to deal with that. In the United States, for example, in 1990, we passed the Americans with Disabilities Act, right? Canada has a similar edict, right? And that's a formal message from the culture saying, this is the law we want to follow. This is what we believe. This is now, a part of who we are. Now, we all know that macro or formal macro laws or rules or, edicts only go so far, right? For example, 1990, we passed the Americans with Disabilities Act in the United States, and that act said that folks with disabilities are within the natural course of the human endeavor, and that accommodations have to be made so that people can live meaningful lives, right? And so, you know, the saying that in a formal way didn't really trickle down to people doing it. It's almost like, you know, they put a law or a rule out saying you're only, you know, going to drive, 100 kilometers an hour on this highway, and you know that most people are probably not going to go 100 kilometers. They're going to go a little bit faster, and so laws don't necessarily change a society, right? What does change um, a perspective or an attitude are relationships, right? Because relationships with somebody who is perceived to be different begins to, you build a relationship with somebody who's different from you, you begin to humanize that person. You begin to see that person like you see them as you, right? So that you change, they don't, their difference doesn't change. Uh, and so at the core of relationships is social capital, right? That's what social capital is, relationships. In fact, if you could wish for three things for someone that you love, what would you wish for? Right? That gets back almost to the exercise we did at the very beginning of this session. And when sociologists ask this question around the world, by the way, what they discover are three responses that are always, in the top five, top eight, always, anywhere, in any country. Um, and these are the three that sort of rise to the top, right? So if you could wish for something, you want people to be healthy, happy, and safe, and live long lives and prosperous lives. That's what you wish for yourself. That's what you wish for your family, your children, right? Now, the interesting thing is that at the core of health, happiness, and longevity is social capital. That's why in the very beginning of this webinar, when we did that little exercise around those 10 things, I said that relationships is antecedent to all the other things, because what we're coming to learn and discover is that social capital is really at the core of people being healthy. And social capital is at the core of people being happy and less depressed. And social capital is at the core of people living longer lives. And this is now corroborated and has been come to, just be understood as real, as viable. So what is social capital? Right? And from a sense of definition, social capital first appeared in the literature in 1916, in the sociological literature, in 1916, when a school teacher in West Virginia in the United States wrote up an article about how schools can help people succeed, right? And what this teacher observed is that the kids who were successful after they graduated from his high school weren't necessarily the kids that were the smartest or the brightest or had the honor roll, scores. It was the kids that connected, that had relationships, that literally were at the foundation of their life success, right? And so he didn't want to term it friendships or relationships, because he really felt that would be easily dismissed by fellow educators and academics. And so he called it social capital. And what he did in the article is he tied the fact to relationships literally leading to benefits that people get from the relationships in their life, right? And in the ensuing research that's unfolded since 1916, when Hannafin first coined the term social capital, sociologists and researchers, anthropologists, other purveyors of society, um, really came to focus in on three key benefits that we get through our relationships. One is they, refer to instrumental benefit. Instrumental value is when you get a tangible return from your friendships. Again, a simple example is if you're, if you're moving from, where you live now to someplace, new, you obviously have to move all your stuff. Now, you can call a moving company and they'll charge you handsomely to move your stuff. Or you can get a case of beer and call your friends and they'll help you move, right? So there's a tangible reciprocity there that is instrumental. Now, it's amazing to think about if you're so inclined. When I wrote a book a couple years ago called Social Capital: The Key to Macro Change, and in that book I tried to look at all the research and apply the concept of social capital to disability intervention, and part of the things that I researched were all these tangible things that you get from relationships if you have those relationships, right? um, but not just instrumental tangible things, but emotional value as well. Just knowing that people got your back, that people are there for you. If your car breaks down at 2 in the morning, do you have somebody you could call? Right now, all of us would probably think about that and say, I don't know, man, I just call AAA, or call Uber, or, and you could do that. You have to pay for that, but we all have in our relationship network people we know we can go to when the chips are down. That's emotional value. And then last is informational value. And informational value is when your social capital, your connections, tell you about something, you try what they tell you, and it works out for you, and that you actually achieve something based on that information, right? So the notion of what you get from relationships has been studied and examined, um, are just incredible. But let me just show you this. Research also shows that social capital is related to these things. I want you to just pause for a minute and look at this list, right? Um, Getting a job. How people get jobs is really not necessarily wrapped up in, I don't know, where they went to school, or, how handsome they are, or uh, getting jobs is really tied to knowing people who can vouch for you, right? Um, and that literally, studies have shown that, think about your very first job, whatever it might have been. How did you get that job, right? And I can almost, I'll bet you some money, that you got that job based on, somebody your dad knew, or somebody your mom knew, or, your big brother, that somehow, some way, a relationship was in between, you and the job, right? I mean, even the current job you have right now, when you look at the job you have right now, I can almost guarantee that when you filled out the application for that big job you have right now, that on the application there was a question saying, can you list 3 people who will vouch for you, right? Who we can call, right? Now, when you put those references down on your job application, I guarantee that you don't put somebody who doesn't know you, right? And that literally you're going to identify some of your social capital because you want them to give you a good reference, right? So the more relationships you have, the more opportunities that present themselves to you, right? look at this fourth bullet on this slide, and I could spend a lot of time just on this topic alone. We obviously don't have that time available today, but these things: tolerance, respect, kindness, compassion, honesty, fairness. Those are called pro-social behaviors. And what research has shown is that you treat people that you know more like that than people you don't know. That you are more tolerant, you're more respectful, you're kinder, you're more honest with people you know than with people you don't know. I always like to use this example because something like compassion, which is a pro-social behavior. I'm sure everybody on this call is compassionate. That you wouldn't be plugged in today to, think about, community engagement opportunities for people who've been marginalized, if you didn't have some compassion in you, right? So you're compassionate people. But listen to this example. Say you have to go to a meeting in Toronto, and so you make the trek to Toronto. You get on on a bus or a subway or whatever, and you get to your destination, and you're going around the corner to go into the building where your meeting is, and laying in the gutter is a homeless guy. He's just laying there, kind of dirty, and you see this, and it affects you, right? Because you're a compassionate person, right? You see people shouldn't be living in gutters. That just a society doesn't, like ours, doesn't do that, right? And so as you walk past the guy in the gutter, you make a mental note to yourself that when you get back home, you're going to write a letter to the prime minister. You're going to reach out to an office, a governmental office, and say, something, we need more funding for homelessness. Okay. So you go to your meeting, and then you return back home, and maybe you write the letter. Probably you don't, because you get you get distracted with other important things you have to do in your life. So flip the scenario now. You're going to a meeting in Toronto. It's a very important meeting. You arrive in Toronto. You're coming around the corner to enter the building where the meeting is, and you see a guy laying in the gutter, dirty, homeless guy. And you get a little closer, and you recognize that the guy laying in the gutter is your Uncle Frank, your favorite uncle when you were growing up. You hadn't seen him in a long time, but there he is in the gutter, right? Uncle Frank. I don't think you go to your meeting. I think you stop and you pick Uncle Frank up, and you say, I'm going to get you something to eat. Let's how did this happen? Uncle Frank, what can I do here, right? Your compassion vaults. Not because well, what causes that is that Uncle Frank, and the humanistic sort of relevance of Uncle Frank changes your behavior. It affects your behavior, right? So these kinds of pro-social behaviors are tied to connections. So simply stated, the quantity and quality of the relationships that you have are important. You're healthier, you're happier, you live longer. All these good things are increased by social capital. Now, herein lies a really important segue, and that is that when I first started to awaken to this notion of social capital in my own practice, and I started to read things like, the social capital does this, this, and this, and the more social capital you have, the better off you are. I started to dig into more literature about social capital, like how much social capital do people have? Like what is it? Like how does it get measured? And I came across an article and then a book from an anthropologist by the name of Robin Dunbar. He's practices out of Cambridge. He's a pretty smart guy. Dunbar, Dunbar. And the book was called The Power of 150, right? And as I dug into it, I wanted to what is this 150? And what Dunbar postulates is that the typical person has 150 important relationships with social obligation. 150. Well, stop and think about your relationships now. How many do you have? And when I read that, I paused and I said, "Holy hell! I don't think 150. That I could only think of five. So I started to dig down and I started to keep a journal and I began to identify people that I knew, people that I had some obligation to socially, right? That we were on a softball team together, we were in a golf league, or some way that I was socially connected to those folks, right? And as I started to journal this, I was just amazed at how many I had. It was well over 300, 350 people, and I'm thinking, holy hell, you know, uh, uh, I have all this social capital. This is fantastic, right? Then I started to think, well, what about my cousin Carrie? Or what about some of the men and women that we serve at my agency in Pittsburgh? How much social capital do they have? And and so I started to do some quantification of social capital through interviews with people we served at our agency, just to get my hands around how many friends do folks have, right? And now I gotta tell you, I want you to think right now about one person at your agency that you serve. Just bring up one recipient of service, maybe residentially, or maybe in a skill building program, or maybe a rec program, or whatever, and somebody and I want you to think about their friendships. I want you to think about how many relationships do you think they have. Okay? You probably don't know for sure, and I would urge you actually to sit down with them and have a conversation to try to see how many people they have in their lives. Now, I've done this. I've done it numerous times. And every time when I've done this with agencies, my own agency or other agencies that I've had the good fortune to get to know, I've come to discover that the numbers of people identified by folks being served by those agencies is about 24. 24. Now, I don't know, maybe yours would be more, maybe not. But my research, and actually we've begun to write this up. We published an article in the Canadian Journal of Disability Studies in 2016, and the article is called "Someone to Love, Someplace to Go, Something to Do" was the title of the article. And it was based on research we did through the University of Toronto in Mississauga. And and what we did was measure engagement, right? We measured social capital and connections and discovered a huge disparity. Now, if you have 150 people with social obligations, I would probably argue most of you have more on this call. But just say you had 150, and then my cousin Carrie has 24. Well, then who's going to have more opportunity for whatever or anything, working, traveling, doing this, doing that? But I mean, it's a numbers game, and I think when you start thinking macro, these things start to become apparent. So, knowing how it could change the lives of canines everywhere, the dog scientists struggled diligently to understand the doorknob principle. So look at these dogs. They see that the action is out there by that tree. That cat is out there, and the only way they can get to go after that cat is if their master lets them out the door, right? But these dog scientists said if we could figure out how to open that damn door ourselves, we could go out there and we could chase that cat, right? So here's my segue. Knowing how it could change the lives of people with disabilities everywhere, the Ontario advocates struggle diligently to understand social capital because it is the doorway, it is the doorknob to a better life, to a more meaningful life. And so to think is to differ, to think about how we have tried to help people get jobs, houses, rides, and friends, and to think about the approach we've taken on that um, and its failure in terms of people having meaningful relationships in their life. We've got to differ with that methodology. And we've got to think about another methodology, another way of using a macro approach of relationship building and invest a little bit more in social capital in getting people connected. So, in some ways, just thinking about this, we need to stop thinking clinically. I mean, some clinical thinking is okay in some situations, but most of the time, clinical thinking sucks you back into the micro model, somebody's problems, eradicating their problems, wasting their time by trying to eradicate their problems. Right? Um, we've got to turn our attention to community. We've got to understand community. Now, in this webinar series, our next sessions, our next two sessions, are really going to focus in on understanding community. So I'll defer some of that to those sessions, but we got to listen to people. And at the very core of this is social capital, because social problems that people experience, social problems of isolation, loneliness, and devaluation, they stem not from somebody's individual differences, but from the failure of our society to meet the needs of all of its members. And so when we get into our webinar next session, we're going to really define community. We're going to really look at it in a very, very strategic kind of way. But just for our purposes here to finish up this session on social capital, um, key ingredients in community are commonality, right? Community is a network of different people who come together regularly for something in common, right? Now, these three key issues, commonality, regularity, and difference, are embedded in any community and in any culture. And this idea of similarities and differences really is a very core principle in building meaningful relationships, because we don't build relationships based on difference. We build them based on similarity. Stop and think about, you go to a conference or a networking meeting, and you're in some reception, and you meet somebody new, you see somebody new. The very first thing you do is try to find, what do we have in common? Where are you from? Where'd you go to college? What kind of music do you like? Or whatever it might be, those commonalities create bridges between people, right? If the person is different from you in every capacity, then I can almost guarantee that relationship is not going to go very far, right? Relationships need similarity and they need regularity. Regularity is just seeing the person again and again and again. And when we get into our next session and we talk about mapping community, regularity is going to come back up again as a pretty important ingredient. And so with the folks that you're working with, we begin to think about the fact that people already have some social capital. Nobody starts at ground zero. Everybody has. I mean, when we had a birthday party for my little grandson Connor, and because of the pandemic, my son and his wife stretched it out for a couple days, and people kind of drove over, and we tried to do it as best we could because of the pandemic. But over 3 days, I was involved every day that people came, and I just made mental notes of how many people were coming to celebrate little Connor's birthday, his second birthday, and I got to tell you, I counted, in the course of those 3 days, 75 people, in a pandemic, who kind of came, took a moment of time to, celebrate. Now, obviously, they were, my son and his wife, Heather's friends, but all of us start life with social capital through our families, right? And so there's always this very start point of social capital. But when we begin to think about this a little bit more, there are some strategies, there are some methodologies of thinking about somebody's relationships, thinking about somebody's social capital. And we call this a sociogram. And you can see it's sort of like a pie. Um, and there are 3 rings. And the furthest out ring is the ring of what we call the ring of acquaintanceship, right? These are people they know you know them, you have some connection to them, but you don't do anything with them. You're driving to work, and you stop by a Starbucks to get a coffee, or Tim Hortons, and because you go every morning, you know the kid who's waiting on you, right? It's an acquaintance. So you know them, they know you, but you don't do anything together. The next circle in are people that you do things with. These are people you do have some obligation to, people that you engage with. And then that innermost circle are people that you deeply care about, your covenancy circle, right? Now you see they're smaller because there are less of those. But when you begin to think about all of these people, we're talking about a lot of folks. Dunbar said in this sociogram, you could have 1,000 people. I mean, a lot of people, you don't engage with them, you don't have an obligation with them, but you know them, they know you. But inside this innermost ring, those covenant relationships. Now, if you look at this little image and you think about it like a pizza pie or an apple pie, and you sliced it, right? And you made a slice out of it in 4 or 5, 6 slices. Each slice of this pie would represent a community that you are involved in, right? So one of the slices of the pie would be your family, right? Another slice of the pie would be your neighborhood. A third slice of the pie might be your church or your synagogue. A fourth slice of the pie might be your work site. A fifth slice of the pie might be, a club or a group or association you belong to. So literally, the more slices that you have in that pie, the more opportunity you have to build relationships. So when we use a sociogram with folks that we serve who have disabilities, the very first evident issue is there's only 1 or 2 slices in that person's pie, right? Their family, the agency, and a bowling league or something, and that's it, right? So literally, when we begin to think about relationship building, we need to think about, more slices of pie, right? Now, building social capital, there are 4 steps. We don't have a whole lot of time to go into this. I just want to overview it with you. The first step is identifying affinities and similarities to other people. The second step is finding a slice of the pie that you could add to the sociogram, finding a community where people share that affinity. Step 3 is understanding how that community operates, the culture of that community. We're going to examine this next session and the 4th session when we talk about the social infrastructure of community. And then lastly, finding somebody who could actually make an introduction for you, could Like, for example, if I was moving to Sault Ste. Marie, and I know how important social capital is, how would I make friends? How would I build more relationships? Right? I would use these steps. Step one is I would say, who is Al Condeluci and what does he like? What does he care about? And then step two, where in Sault Ste. Marie do people who like, I don't know, to golf or who like music, jazz music, where do they gather? Right? And they match my interest. And then how does that community operate? What are the expectations? And then lastly, how could I meet somebody or who might introduce me to other people already in that club? Right? Now, the key here is, step one, right? Assessing my affinities, right? And so to that end, I want to kind of share with you, we use a tool. In fact, in our project at Algoma, Community Living Algoma, we're using a tool called the cultural profile, right? And this is a kind of a methodology. It's a tool. I'm going to show you a copy of this. I think that Tanya had sent you this copy, but and I apologize for the kind of crude slide here, but this is the cultural profile, and it's a very simple little, sheet of paper that literally asks a couple questions and mostly begins to examine what do people like, what are they interested in, what do they care about. Now, you can see down at the bottom of this paper, there are prompts, um, because for some people who have really been disconnected from community, maybe institutionalized, maybe overprotected, maybe have had limited exposure, they may not know what they like or what they are interested in. They might not be sure of what could be best for them. So, in terms of just getting a sense of what might people like. Now, this cultural profile will we'll talk about this again in the next session, and especially in mapping community, because one of the things that we were doing in our project at CLA is step two, right? Which is essentially finding a matching group that would correspond to cooking or a movie club or music or yoga or finding a place where people gather to celebrate that affinity, right? So literally kind of gauging what people like, who you are and what you like about. Now, this cultural profile is just a prompt. You know, you the idea of discovering somebody's affinities is really a conversation. This profile, prompts you in a conversation with somebody about what they might like too, right? And it gives you a start point in terms of finding another slice of the pie for this person's sociogram, right? Another place. Now, just finding a slice of the pie is not enough. I mean, obviously, you find the slice of the pie, you gotta make sure that that slice of the pie is regular, that people gather again and again and again, because regularity is such an important ingredient to building relationships. So, kind of putting these things together are the stepstones of finding greater meaning or more meaningful opportunity in community. So, guys, the magic of community is when similarities override differences. What makes us connect are the things we have in common, right? Not the things that we're different about. In fact, differences can polarize. I mean, look at the United States. What's happened with the politics, the pot stirred by Trump, but literally, this has sort of torn families apart. between the differences in what your political perspective is from my political perspective, causes people to not want to be around each other, right? So relationships don't these kinds of differences can be toxic for a relationship. That's why, I mean, they're there, the differences are there, and you're not burying your head in the sand or forgetting that they're there. You're just saying they're not the things you build a relationship around. You build a relationship around something in common, something that you have similar. So let me just conclude, and we'll get ready for some questions. I hope you have some questions and about this notion of social capital and how we can sort of harness it a bit to create greater meaningful opportunities. So let me just share with you, and let me just end with this notion that he who would be a leader, let him first become a bridge. And this idea of bridging is really important because in social capital, there are two types of elements to social capital. There's bridging social capital, and then there's bonding social capital. So bridging social capital is we have differences, but it's our similarities that bridge us together. And then bonding social capital is that we discover more and more important things about who we are, and we share that. And that creates a greater sense of connection and a greater sense of covenancy. So let me just finish with this poem, which really is about bridging, understanding bridging. And the poem goes like this. An old man going a lone highway came at the evening cold and gray to a chasm vast, deep, and wide. The old man crossed in the twilight dim, that sullen stream held no fear for him. But he turned when safe on the other side, and he built a bridge to span the tide. Old man, said a fellow pilgrim near, you're wasting your time with building here. You never again will pass this way. Your journey will end at the close of this day. You've crossed a chasm deep and wide. Why are you building this bridge at eventide? The builder lifted his old gray head. Good friend, in the way that I've come, he said, there follows after me this day a youth whose feet must pass this way. This stream, which has been nothing to me, to the fair-haired youth might a pitfall be. And yes, he too must cross in the twilight dim. Good friend, I'm building this bridge for him. Now, I love this poem. I love the metaphor that it speaks to, which is that all of us have had chasms in our life, and we find ourselves in a challenge, and we work through the chasm, and we try to get to a resolution, right? So in this poem, the builder gets through the chasm, he arrives to the other side, and when he gets to the other side, he starts building a bridge back to where he came from, which was not a very good place, right? And the pilgrim sees this, and the pilgrim says, "Wow, you're crazy. What do you? Why are you going to want to go back there? There's nothing back there. There's hope. Isolation and loneliness and unemployment. It's just bad back there. Why would you ever want to go back there?" The builder says, I'm not building this bridge for me to go back. So I'm building this bridge for Carrie to come across a little easier or a little faster, right? I'm building this bridge for him. Now, this notion about building bridges really gets to, I think, the final point of this notion of social capital. And that is, if we want a more inclusive culture and a more caring culture, it really starts with us and with the bridges that we build, right? And this really makes everything we've talked about so much more personal, right? Um, and and the notion is that every one of us on this call, we haven't, our lives aren't perfect or aren't always perfect, right? But our lives are pretty good. I think most of us would sort of would look at our lives and say, oh, yeah, I mean, there's been some downs, but I'm doing okay. I got a job, I got a house, I got a ride, I get friends, and so in some ways, you've made it. You're there on the other side of that chasm, right? Um, and so in thinking about the bridges that we build to really help others come across, really becomes a very personal element to thinking about this notion of social capital. And so here's my last cartoon, and this is one of my favorite Gary Larson cartoons. Look at the this is a sliding board, and there's two spiders, and they have this thing called the web. They use it in other places, but they built the web at the bottom of the sliding board. And the one spider says to the other, if we pull this off, we'll eat like kings. And I love this cartoon because of the optimism of these spiders that they might catch a kid, right? And that's, I think, what we're doing in the project that we're involved in with Community Living Algoma. That's what we're really focusing in on this webinar series, is that we can do better. We can reach further. Maybe not, it's not going to work every time, but there are other things we can do in a macro way that will make our community a better place, and will make room for other people who have been left behind. So my last quote, and then we'll open this up to questions, is from Martin Luther King Jr. And we just celebrated Dr. King's holiday just a couple weeks ago. And Dr. King wrote, and this is just a short little quote from a longer essay that he wrote called Notes from a Birmingham Jail. Dr. King wrote that in 1963 when he was arrested in Birmingham, Alabama, for trying to order sandwiches in a restaurant. And the restaurant had a sign saying, "No colors allowed." Dr. King went in anyway. He wanted to order some sandwiches for his colleagues, and they wouldn't serve him. And not only would they wouldn't serve him, they called the police, and the police came and arrested Dr. King for breaking the law. And while he was writing this essay called Notes from a Birmingham Jail, he was reflecting on inclusive community, and this, I love this quote, right? In a new sense, all life is interrelated, Dr. King says. All persons are caught up in an inescapable network of mutuality tied to a single garment of destiny. Whatever affects one of us directly affects all of us indirectly. I can never be what I ought to be, and you can never be what you ought to be until I am what I ought to be. This is the interrelated structure of reality. What Dr. King is talking about here is that the men and women that your agency serves, they're not clients, and they're not participants, and they're not consumers, or they're essentially your brothers and sisters, right? They're you and you're them, and if they get devalued, or if they get marginalized, or if they get set apart, or if people say they're CLA people, then any of the rest of us can be devalued and marginalized. And the mere fact that most of the people that we support have such limited social capital should be a clarion call for us to wake up and begin to say, boy, if we don't address this, we're never going to get to the kinds of goals of meaningful, inclusive community opportunities for people. And so, with that being said, I'm going to put up this last slide with contact information for me. And the only reason I do this is because we're going to open it up now to question and answer. And, if you don't get a chance to pose a question, or if you are uncomfortable posing a question, you can pose that question directly to me at my email address, which is on this slide. I also invite you to take a look at my website, and on the website there are lots of resources there. There's lots of white papers, and there's videos. In fact, I did a TED Talk a couple years ago here in Pittsburgh on social capital, and that TED Talk is up on the website if you're interested in kind of looking at another perspective. That wasn't necessarily a disability perspective. That was thinking about social capital from a broader community perspective. Also, my Twitter handle, I try to blog regularly and tweet about community and about community connection. So here's some contact information for me. But what we want to do now is we have about a half an hour, and if any questions that you might have, you can pose them. We're going to go into the chat room first. We're going to ask Tanya and Corey to monitor that chat room. We'll react to whatever questions are in there, and then if there's some direct questions, we'll be happy to take them. So I'm going to stop sharing this screen, and I'm going to open this up now, and ask Tanya and Corey if they could monitor the chat room to see. I think we have 6 comments in there, and maybe we can get started with some questions or reactions to understanding social capital. So do we have anything in there, Tanya?
Yes, I'm just, so any suggestions on how to go about building social capital, specifically with people who live with attachment disorders, or any good resources on this that you can direct us to?
Okay, attachment disorders just need a little bit more clarity in terms of.
Tanya or Tanya, do you want to speak more to that?
Just so I understand the question more clearly. You read the question again, Tanya?
Yeah. Any suggestions on how to go about building social capital, specifically with people who live with attachment disorders, or any good resources on this that you can direct us to?
Yeah, let me just react this way to the question in terms of what most research on social capital speaks to is that people who are at greatest risk of social isolation and loneliness are folks that have less than 5 important relationships. And most of the researchers are pretty clear that 5 is like a tipping point, and that if people have less than 5 really important relationships, they're at risk of some of those negative things that we talked about last time related to social isolation and loneliness. So you don't have to have thousands of friends. You just have to have, a handful of important relationships, right? And so that notion, when we think about that sociogram that I showed, and we talked a little bit about Robin Dunbar, and some of the numbers that he sort of associates with that. Dunbar says that we can have close to 1,500 people in our total sociogram, 150 with social obligation, and then he focuses a little bit more and says 15 covenant relationships with at least five core relationships. Those are Dunbar's numbers. Now, attachment disorders, or people who may be shy or introverted or socially uncomfortable, can still build relationships, and especially if they're bridges to similarity. So I think the methodology of what we talked about here with, with identifying affinity, finding the matching community, understanding the community's behavior, and then finding the gatekeeper, that still fits, even if somebody is experiencing an attachment disorder. And it might be that the gathering point is not some loud, backslapping, place. It could be, something much softer. It can be something much less intrusive, but connectable nonetheless. Good questions. Lots of times I get questions on introvert and extroverts, and if people aren't extroverts, how can they build relationships? And I think it's still the same construct. Um, for some people, it's easier to engage. For other people, it's a little more challenging. It really makes you think about the matching community a lot more. That if you have somebody who's shy and reticent, then you might really be cautious about a loud and boisterous community setting. The person may just not thrive there.
Al, your next comment in the chat, the webinar really reminds me of the medical and social model of disability, also of the disability justice and how your society can't reach its full potential without ensuring it is lifting everyone up.
Right. Absolutely. That's such a great comment, because it clearly, when the more you begin to move from micro to macro, the more you really get into this whole civic, social justice, agenda, and that clearly, if people are kept in a micro side, it's easy to medicalize them. It's easy to segregate them, separate them, stereotype them, devalue them. But when we move into a macro interpretation, we're really thinking now as a citizen than a client or a patient or a person with a diagnosis. So citizenship is really a different phenomena. I just finished a really great book on macro issues. It's called Rekindling Democracy, and it's by Cormac Russell. And it's really an excellent expose on moving from client identity to a citizen identity. And it's really a very powerful, very recent book. It just came out earlier last year. But moving into citizenship is really a critical piece of understanding the macro interpretation. Great point.
Ali, your next question or your next comment in the chat. So throughout the last few years, we've initiated an approach. Sorry, the chat just jumped. Give me 1 second here. Throughout the last few years, we've initiated an approach with our community to present a citizen as opposed to a client, with the hopes of creating some meaningful engagement of community services, particularly with people identified as presenting with challenging behavior. It has not garnered the results we expected, but we determined to stay the course. Any advice on how we fine-tune our approach?
Yeah.
John.
Yeah, that's, there's no question that that this notion of staying the course really is critical. That when here's I think the key thing to understand: when you're in a micro approach, you're in a laboratory. You have control of the variables. You are it's not as messy or as risky. When you move into community, you're really moving out of that laboratory and you're moving into, quote, like the real world. And it's messy. There's greater risk. There's unfortunate things that can happen. Now, obviously, trying to minimize those things is really what we're going to talk about in our next session and the session after that. Next session is really mapping community and understanding community, because what we're talking about here is matching the person to the right community, and not just dumping the person in community and hoping that things go well. It's really being strategic and intelligent, if you will, about what communities you're choosing. Here's an example. When you think about your family and your children, and when when your children begin to socialize, right? You want to really make sure that where they socialize is viable, is a viable place, right? You don't want them just to socialize. You want to select. I mean, you get your child involved in a, I don't know, in a hockey league. You don't just choose it. I mean, you really want to choose a place, and you want to really understand it before before you release your child to that setting. So I think, although I'm not trying to make this sound childlike, I want to make it strategic in that we just don't, dump someone somewhere, because they have a right to be in community, they have this, they should have the same opportunity as everyone else. Well, that's true, but we're talking about folks who have really socially not been exposed very much. And so when we think about the receptacle setting where we kind of create the bridge, we want to be strategic. We want to make sure we don't select some place that can be too fast or maybe too risky for the person that we're supporting, because they just haven't had that kind of exposure. It's like your child. When you get your child first involved in socializing, you want it to be a setting that's going to be somewhat safe, and that sooner or later, the child, as they get more exposure and more experiences, and you become more confident in them, then they take greater risk in the things that they do. So I think that some of that same sort of mentality applies here. And that's why our next session, and by the way, our next session is going to be on February 9th. That's a Tuesday, is really an important session, because it's going to be about mapping community, and it's going to be about understanding what places we select from in terms of meaningful connections. Um, and and so I think staying the course, but also being intelligent about it, recognizing that communities differ. There are some communities that are faster than other communities. There are some communities that are more that require more risk taking, and that's okay. But we just need to be strategic in our thinking, and especially if the individual that we're supporting is really compromised or has been very limited in exposure. We want to just make sure that we're guiding the person, and then supporting them, which, by the way, comes up in session 4, which is understanding the infrastructure and the expectations. So session 3 and 4 are really going to be kind of important parts to understanding macro approaches. Other questions that come in there, Core?
Yep. Next question here. So there was another great bridge metaphor in the resource handout that Tanya sent out. It was insightful even in terms of how we find our own perspective. Is there a magic number or percentage that can illustrate if there has been a successful shift in new thinking? Or what methods of measurement are used? Is a matter of engagement?
Yeah. Wow. What a great question, and what a great insight. And that literally there are measurement tools, if you will. Next session, we're going to examine one of those tools. It's called the Social Capital Benchmarking Survey. And essentially what it does is it sort of identifies places and spaces in community. And part of our project at Community Living Algoma is really to be not just thoughtful about this, but also have a research component. So we're going to baseline people that we're supporting using these new community interventions, and we're going to baseline how engaged are people right now, and then we're going to provide a wraparound intervention approach, being very strategic in terms of identifying community, and then creating the opportunity for the individual to begin to bridge in, um, and then be supportive as the person gets more engaged with that community. Um, Ultimately, remeasuring down the road engagement patterns. And what we really hope and expect will happen is that we'll see an increase in engagement patterns in the folks that we're really supporting in this wraparound intervention methodology. Um, the other measurement that we're going to use is the loneliness scale. And if you remember last session, we talked about the UCLA loneliness scale, and the 20 measure item that looks at, that has a Likert scale, and people get baselined in terms of how how they feel right now about connectedness. And we want to baseline again our test group on both the social capital benchmarking survey and the UCLA loneliness scale, so we can get some start numbers. And then as we support folks and as they become more engaged, we're gonna measure further down the road, hopefully seeing some very clear quantification changes in terms of how those measures come out over time. So I think measuring community engagement is tricky business. It's not easy to do. And that's the difference as well between micro and macro. In a micro approach, the measurement, you control the variables, the measurements are very tangible. That, like, for example, in the laboratory, if you get hydrogen and oxygen and you take two parts of hydrogen and one part of oxygen, you put it together, you're going to get water, right? And in the community, measuring things is messy. It's not, you're going on what people are reporting to you, you're going on what you're observing, and those things are hard scientifically to quantify. So the research that's been done and the research we're going to do is considered to be what they call action research, which is kind of moment in time examinations, using the best stuff that you have available to be able to chart movement, persons going from point A to point B. It's almost like thinking about your own life. You think about your life now, pre-pandemic, what you were doing, and now while we're in the throes of the pandemic, has your life changed, and how do you know it's changed, and do you have any numbers that can tell you that? And if you take your temperature, you can get a clear number of whether you have a fever or not. But in terms of feeling like less engaged, how do you measure that? Now we know, for example, with pandemic, we know we're seeing depression and we're seeing, anxieties begin to go up based on people, calling their doctor, calling their therapist, reporting that they're uncomfortable. But really being, scientifically clear about that gets harder when you're measuring community. So we're making the path by walking it here. We we know that there's some things out there that we've studied and we're applying. Other things we're going to learn as we go. At the end of the day, the notion about someone being engaged gets down to, do people call, do people know them, do people appreciate when they're there? They're really simple things: being acknowledged, being accepted, being appreciated. Those are hard how do you know you're appreciated, right? It's a feeling you get when you walk in someplace and people are glad to see you. You can tell that. So those are the things that we're confronting with when we think about the community engagement. That's one of the reasons why our field has been so stuck in the micro paradigm, is because these are hard things to measure, they're hard things to get your hand around. There's greater risk, there's greater ambiguity, but we're going to take it on. We really feel that the approach that we're taking, is worth it. That, the other things that we've been doing, the field has done, has just not resulted in full citizenship and meaningful participation. Next question.
Yeah, next one is, how do you start the process of gathering data for a cultural profile analysis? Would you have the frontline staff work with a person?
Yeah, that's a great question. And what I've done with that cultural profile, both in the agency that I hired from, as well as in agency and coaching, has been to do like have the staff members actually do it on themselves, and literally begin to identify, start to get comfortable with that, might be, and then once they get comfortable, that's a conversation that you have with somebody you serve. It's not an assessment, it's really a conversation. And that's, by the way, the difference between micro and macro. In micro, we do assessments. In macro, we have conversations. And a conversation is just probing. And all the cultural profile is a prompt of making sure that you don't forget to ask something in your conversation with the person about what they what they like, and also sharing with them what you like. That happens in conversations too. Conversations are never one-sided. They're always balanced. So if I'm doing a cultural profile with somebody that we support at our agency, I'm going to have a conversation with them over a cup of coffee, and I'll have that cultural profile there available for me, but I'm just using it as a prompt. And I'm not taking, I'm not filling out the form while I'm conversing with them. I'm just making mental notes, and then when I finish the conversation, which is, by the way, respectful. Assessments are downward. It's like, we've all been to the doctor when they've done these assessments. Have you done this? Have you ever been depressed? Have you ever done, and they're asking us these questions, and we're, yeah, no, yeah, no. Yeah, it's, you know that you're not, I mean, you just don't feel a connectedness, where a conversation with somebody is really just coming to discover, who they are as a human being, and sharing with them who you are as a human being. So there is a coaching process about this that I would recommend. You could take a look at the profile that Tanya had sent you. Take a look at it. And by the way, this could be, you can change and alter this any way you feel would be useful at your agency or your culture, or what is realistic, to you, because obviously there's differences in terms of what is happening in a community and in a culture. The last thing about the cultural profile that I just want to add is that when you're having these conversations and you're kind of looking at this and saying, you know, um, have you ever thought about, an interest in maybe gardening or music or art? Um, the person might say no, but that doesn't necessarily discount that they might be interested in that they just never thought that it might be possible. So I think you want to be guarded about the uh, the finite sort of okay, well, I asked them if they were interested in in photography, and they said no. Well, how did you probe about that? And maybe if you said something, well, I mean, gee, Manise, for, photographers come in all sizes and shapes, and you don't have to be a pro to be interested in, images, and that might open the person up to say, well, gee, I never thought that that might be possible for me, but now that you mention it, maybe, so I think we want to just be, we want to be fair in not quickly assuming that the person is not, it might be they're not interested in something, and that's okay. You don't push it, but you want to make sure that if they say they're not interested in something, it's not because either they don't understand it or never thought that they could ever do it. You want to probe around that a bit. Good question. Thank you. And
Okay,
I
now
think,
we have one more comment in the chat, and then we can move to take a couple hands if you want. So this comment comes from a CLA. She's saying, Crip Camp on Netflix is a great documentary on how formal change doesn't always trickle down to actual change, and what the disability community did to get more accessible public transportation after the American Disability Act was passed.
yeah. Wow, Crip Camp was, what a great film. If you haven't seen it, you might want to track it down. It's on Netflix, and it follows. It's from the early '70s, and it follows 4 or 5 young people who were campers at this camp in New York called Camp Jened, and and the experiences that they had at this camp, you're right, they later on laid the foundation for, folks becoming really incredible advocates. And that film was really, I was really taken by it for a couple reasons. One is that Judy Heumann, um, who is uh, who is highlighted in the film, um, is a friend of mine. So, and I've known her since the late '70s, as an advocate. But it also took me back to my early years, in disability advocacy, where we did a camping experience as well, which was very similar. It was kind of like just people having a chance to be themselves. Um, and the kinds of things that we all learned in that experience was just unbelievable. And so if you get a chance, take a look at Crip Camp. Um, the last thing about that film that I just an aside, but I think it's an important one. The producers of that film were Barack and Michelle Obama. They actually underwrote that film to be produced. And Barack Obama was, prior to becoming the president of the United States, and the senator from Illinois, was a community organizer. And as a community organizer, he really understood the power and prominence of community and the whole macro kind of thing. So lots of interesting connections of dots in the film Crip Camp. Take a look at it.
Great. We have another great comment that or question that we should do from the chat here. So it's often in smaller rural communities, specific communities of interest don't exist. To what extent does a virtual community have on an individual, and does an in-person versus digital relationship weigh differently?
Yeah, wow. Such a great question. And we're going to explore a little bit of virtual community, next session, because virtual community is alive and well, and we can't discount it, as a resource pool. Um, However, actual community, face-to-face community, is really the most satisfying. Virtual communities can be a port in the storm, but the ultimate satisfaction is when you're actually sitting with somebody and looking at them and sharing, breathing the same air, so to speak. Um, so the notion of virtuality, understanding virtual community, and having that play a supplemental role in life, I think is important. The risk here is that virtual community can become somebody's entire life, and that's not where we want to go. I mean, I think we want to acknowledge virtual community, and we want to be aware of it. We want to be able to have it. Now, let me just say a word about rural communities, because there's no question that an urban community, what it has to offer is different from what a rural community has to offer and what a suburban community has to offer. So when you look at those sort of three delineations of community, the rural community, obviously, because of geography and space, and is more difficult to get your hands around. But people gather. Now they gather for maybe different reasons, and therein really lie, I think, some of the keys to accessing rural community. It's interesting you raise that, because I'm involved in a project right now in New York State, and an agency in New York State that represents people with disabilities got a grant to focus in on rural community engagement. And so I've been working with them, in fact, doing a very similar webinar series for them on that, and really looking more closely at rural community opportunities and places and spaces. Next session, when we do the mapping, we're gonna get into that a little bit more, and we're gonna talk about. See, there's a thing. People gather around things they like, but they mostly gather more to be with other people, and doing something that they like is a little whipped cream, but the real nut and bolts is other people, right? Just being with other people. So if somebody identifies a particular area that they're interested, and there is no tangible group in a rural community that gathers around that issue, then I think what we need to do is really just think about, are there concentrically other groups that might have some tie-in. So we'll talk a bit more about that in our next session. But that's really a thoughtful comment. There is a difference between virtual and actual community, obviously, and rural and urban and suburban communities do differ, and we need to be sensitive to that.
So Al, it is 12 o'clock, and we do have one question from the floor. So
Okay.
if Louisa wants to share her question, and then just being mindful of the time.
Yes.
I'm sorry, I didn't realize it was 12 and not 12:30.
Time goes by fast when you're having fun.
Okay, well, this is a question we talk about at home a lot, so I want your intake on this. Do you think, and I wrote some stuff down, do you think the evolution of social capitalism has regressed over time? And I'll give you an example. When I grew up with my family, like, you'd jump out into the neighborhood and everybody congregated. It didn't matter what you were, who you were, disability, no disability. And why do you think there's a shift, if you think there's a shift, and how can we pull from the, back in that era and bring it back?
Yeah, that's a great question. And just a quick response, especially since we're out of time. We're going to address this just a little bit more next session, because most of the research on social capital confirms what you feel, and that is we're seeing a deterioration in social capital, or diminution is maybe the better word, in terms of relationships. And sociologists have begun to say, why is that? And there is some actual reasons that have emerged as to why people are connecting less. The person that really wrote about this, that I think you would really be intrigued to take a look at his work, is Robert Putnam, and the book is called Bowling Alone by by Robert Putnam, Putnam. And even though his research, he's from Harvard, and his research is, is centric to the United States, I think the applicability of what he speaks to is worldwide. So take a look at Putnam. And next month, on February 9th, when we come together again, we're going to dig a little bit more into this ebb and flow of social capital and why Putnam has 4 reasons why we're seeing less social capital. And I think they're as true in Canada as they are in the United States or in Australia or in other places where I've studied this. So take a look at the book, and we could talk more about it next time. Tanya, I think that Bewitching our folks have been just so.
I know we could talk all day, right, Al?
Yeah, to hang in there, and this has really been great. Hopefully, this has been helpful. I want to thank everyone for their time and attention and hanging in there. I know Zoom trainings aren't the easiest thing with a talking head, and there's not as much opportunity to engage as we would like, but it's the port in the storm for us. And we wanted to get this information out. And as we move through our voyage, hopefully you'll be able to join us in February when we begin to focus in on community. Tanya, thanks so much for all the work you've done in coordinating this. Thank Community Living Algoma for putting this all together. And have a great day. Be safe. Build relationships.
Thank you very much, Al, and we'll talk soon.
Thanks.
Thank
See you guys.
you.
Everyone.